Hello everyone, today we will step into the shadows of a time when fear was not just a feeling, it was a method of rule. Imagine riding through the mists of Wallachia in the dead of morning. The air is still. The birds refuse to sing. And then, through the fog, you see them, bodies, dozens at first, then hundreds. Some lifeless, some barely alive, all mounted on sharpened stakes. The forest breathes, but it does not live. It watches. Before we get started on this story, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And when we reach the end, leave your thoughts in the comments. Was Vlad a patriot, or a monster made of shadow and blood? It began as many stories do, with travelers. A group of Ottoman scouts had crossed into Wallachian territory in early spring, not long after the thaw. They were under orders to monitor border movements, nothing more. But by the third day, the trail they followed twisted into an eerie silence. The ground became spongy, the air thick with rot. The first sign was a dog, black, ribs showing, its muzzle soaked red. It sat by the road, guarding nothing. It didn't growl. It just stared. Then the first corpse. It hung in the air like fruit from a tree, except the tree was a sharpened stake hammered into the earth. The man impaled upon it wore the garb of a Wallachian farmer, no armor, no weapon. His eyes bulged but were glassy. A fly crawled from his mouth. The scouts froze. Then one of them whispered, "There's more." And there were. The path curved into a clearing, and suddenly the forest opened to reveal a ghastly orchard, row upon row of men and women on stakes. Some were Turkish soldiers, others looked like peasants. Some bodies were ancient and sun-bleached. Others still twitched. The spikes were of varying height, arranged with surgical care. Children were hoisted higher than their mothers. Some impalements were clean and vertical, others were angled, slow, cruel. The leader of the scouts dropped to his knees. Not in prayer. His body had simply stopped responding to fear. He had heard of Vlad III, son of Vlad Dracula, known in whispers as Teeps, the Impaler. But seeing this was beyond legend. It was a theater of cruelty. What the scouts didn't know was that this display had a purpose. Vlad didn't impale for randomness. He selected his victims with intent. Traitors, spies, vagabonds, rival nobles, and sometimes entire villages, each became part of his warning to the world. The forest of the impaled, as it came to be known, was a message to enemies: cross this land, and your end will not be swift, nor private. But Vlad didn't just want to kill. He wanted memory. He had the stakes measured, the bodies arranged by category. Men who had betrayed him faced the rising sun, thieves faced the forest, forever exiled. It was not madness, it was ritual. Stories spread quickly. Merchants who once traveled gladly through Wallachia diverted their routes. Border towns emptied at dusk. And yet, the people under Vlad's rule did not all live in terror. Some whispered that they felt safer, knowing crime had vanished under his iron order. A single coin could be left on a fountain's edge and remain untouched for days. But the fear never lifted. Back in the capital of Targovist, Vlad stood atop the battlements of his fortress, staring into the horizon where smoke from Ottoman camps coiled into the sky. His mind did not drift. He did not flinch. Below him, soldiers cleaned the sharpened ends of newly prepared stakes, dragging them through barrels of pig fat to ensure a slower, more agonizing death for those who would be hoisted upon them. Vlad watched them work with the care of a gardener tending roses. And in the dungeons beneath, the next display was being arranged. One prisoner, an outspoken monk who had criticized Vlad's methods, was being scrubbed and dressed in ceremonial robes. His stake had been carved with old Christian symbols, not out of respect, but mockery. Vlad had a taste for irony. "He preaches of heaven," he had once said. "Then let him be closest to it." That night, the fires around the forest crackled again. The scout who had first stumbled into the nightmare managed to escape, just barely, and his tale would soon spread across borders, carried like a plague into the courts of Buda, Vienna, and even Rome. Some believed it. Others dismissed it as wartime fiction. But the fear stuck. And Vlad knew it. He counted on it. And soon, he would invite witnesses, not enemies, not peasants, but nobles, guests, ambassadors, to stand near his table while the blood of the dying fed the roots of the land he claimed to love. And that land, twisted and trembling, would learn not to forget his name. The boy was no one important. Not a noble, not a soldier. Just a servant. His name was Eli, and he had been sweeping the corridor floors of the voivode's stronghold since he was 8 years old. Small enough to go unnoticed. Quick enough not to anger the guards. He never spoke unless spoken to and never looked directly into the eyes of the men he served. In Vlad's court, invisibility was the greatest protection. Eli had learned the rhythms of the castle like a song. When the sun struck the western tower, the guards would change. When the bell rang 3 times, someone was about to die. When silence settled over the entire compound, it meant the voivode himself was moving through the halls. On one such evening, Eli was polishing the brass edges of the great hall's throne dais when he heard it, that silence. It pressed down like a wet cloth, muffling every creak of wood and whisper of wind. He froze, rag in hand, and turned just enough to see a shadow glide across the stone floor. Vlad. The prince wore black, not the dark of mourning, but the black of control. His cloak rustled like leaves dragged across a crypt. His boots made no sound. He walked with the stillness of a ghost who'd forgotten it had died. Behind him came 2 soldiers, dragging a man whose face had been bruised to the color of rotten plums. The man had once been a clerk, Eli recalled, a tax collector who had tried to skim from the treasury. Small theft. Petty greed. In any other land, a whipping, perhaps exile. But not here. Not under Vlad. The boy did not watch the impalement directly. But he heard it. From the shadowed archway near the courtyard, he stood frozen, listening. The man did not scream right away. It was the wood that spoke first, the deep groan as it pierced flesh, the snapping of ribs, the soft hiss of blood meeting iron. Then came the human sounds, choking, gasping, the shrill rise of a man who realized death would not come quickly. Eli's stomach turned. But he did not run. He could not. Because Vlad was speaking. Let him face the kitchens, the voivode said. Let the scent of food reach him before the end. It was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. To Vlad, these moments were teachings. Later, Eli would overhear things. Hushed voices behind thick doors. Nobles debating his methods. Priests arguing about damnation. But Vlad never explained himself. He didn't need to. His lessons were etched into the stone, the earth, and the boy's bones. That night, Eli was summoned to bring wine to the private chamber near the armory. It was a small room, rarely used, except for when Vlad wanted to speak in private. When the boy entered, he kept his eyes down. Do you know why I do what I do? Vlad asked. Eli said nothing. He didn't know if the question was meant for him. Vlad didn't seem to care. He poured wine, deep red, almost black, into a goblet and watched the fire dance in its reflection. Because fear is the only truth that men do not betray. Then he drank. In the days that followed, Eli saw more. A traitor knight, once considered a friend, hoisted with ceremony. The impalement performed in near silence, as if in prayer. A woman accused of spreading false prophecy. Her stake adorned with lilies, her favorite flower. Vlad did not smile. But neither did he rage. He observed. He recorded. And Eli began to understand. This was not simply punishment. It was theater. Control. Power made visible. The boy aged quickly. His innocence burned away in those courtyards. He began to move with the quietness of the guards. He learned to look without seeing, to clean without feeling. But deep inside, he kept every image, every scream, every whispered order. One night he found something peculiar. A book, bound in dark leather, left on the steps of the chapel Vlad rarely entered. Inside were sketches, drawings of the human body, of stakes, of diagrams showing how the organs shifted when a body was impaled at an angle. It was scientific, detached. But in the margins, Vlad had written something. Pain is the language of memory. Only those who suffer carry truth with them to the grave. Eli closed the book and returned it where he'd found it. He did not speak of it to anyone. Years later, when other princes came and went, when whispers of rebellion returned to the valley, when foreign banners flapped once more near the borders, Eli would remember that night, not just the impalement, not just the blood, but the ritual of it all. The choreography. The belief. And as more foreigners entered Wallachia, some to parley, others to spy, they would all meet the same conclusion: this land did not forget pain. Because pain was the soil in which its ruler had planted every seed of his reign. And the boy who once served silently? He would become the record keeper. The only man left alive who had seen every performance from behind the curtains. The invitations had been written by hand, elegant Latin calligraphy upon parchment sealed with the dark red wax of Vlad's crest, a dragon coiled around a cross. The messengers rode hard, delivering them to every noble house, every foreign outpost, every ambassadorial residence from Buda to Brashov. Come, the letters said. Come dine in Targovist. Come witness the civility and hospitality of Wallachia. Some thought it a trap. Others, an opportunity. For those unfamiliar with Vlad's methods, it was an honor. For those who had only heard whispers, it was a calculated risk. But to decline such an invitation, to refuse the hand of a prince, was to invite insult. And in Wallachia, insult was rarely answered with words. So they came. Hungarians in fine coats, German barons in fur-lined boots, and even 2 Turkish envoys veiled in courtesy but watching everything. They arrived in pairs, greeted with measured pomp. Vlad himself did not meet them at the gates. He waited in the dining hall, the hearth roaring, the table set not with golden platters but with carved wooden dishes stained with deep lacquer. A Wallachian feast, he said, to honor his guests. Eli stood in the corner, now older, his frame longer, his hands still and obedient. He remembered when they started arriving, the foreigners stepping lightly across the blood-slick flagstones, marveling at the fortress's stark grandeur. Vlad was already seated, flanked by no guards. Only a long oak table separated him from the gathered men. Eat, he said. You've come a long way. The food was rich, the wine thicker than expected. Some laughed, others whispered. Vlad said little. He only watched. And then, mid-meal, he gestured. A soldier entered through a rear door and approached with a slow, practiced gait. Behind him came another. And between them, a man, barely alive, dragged forward on torn legs, mouth gagged, body trembling. He had no name. Or rather, his name didn't matter. The soldiers hoisted him without hesitation. The guests turned, some out of curiosity, others in sudden dread, as the man was lifted onto a tall wooden stake, greased and sharpened. The stake's tip vanished between his legs, and with a motion as smooth as any craftsman's, the soldiers let gravity take over. The man's body slid downward, slow, controlled, so precise it seemed unreal. The room fell utterly silent, save for the wet creak of the descent. Vlad sipped his wine. One of the German barons vomited into a silver bowl. The Hungarian ambassador's hand trembled as he reached for his goblet, though he did not drink. The Turkish envoys looked at each other and said nothing. This man, Vlad said softly, was a traitor. He traded letters to my enemies for coin. Now, he serves as warning and entertainment both. Someone stammered. In our land such things are done behind closed doors. Vlad turned to the speaker. And that is why treason festers there. The dying man had not yet stopped moving. His eyes darted, his body writhed in helpless reflex, though his screams had long gone silent. Vlad rose from his seat and walked to the stake, no hurry in his step. He stood beside the impaled man, watching his body twitch like a leaf in wind. Then he turned to his guests. You see cruelty. I see order. You see horror. I see peace. A murmur passed among the envious. Some were ready to leave. But no one dared speak it aloud. That night, long after the hall had been cleared, Vlad met with the two Turkish visitors in private. Ili, as ever, remained in the shadows, listening. You ride under the Sultan's banner, Vlad said, and yet you come with eyes wide open. One of the envoys replied, measured and calm. We come only to observe, not to judge. Vlad smiled thinly. You've seen the stake. Now hear the reason. My people are few. My enemies are many. If they do not fear me, they will devour me. So I teach them fear. He gestured toward the window, where the moon lit the dark silhouette of the impaled man still standing outside, frozen mid-death. Pain, Vlad whispered, makes memory eternal. The Turkish men nodded, though their faces betrayed discomfort. And when they returned to the Ottoman court, they reported truthfully, not only about Walachia's defenses, but about the prince who ruled it through a balance of dread and discipline. Word spread. Not just of the impalements, but of the man who dined beside them, unbothered, unmoved. A prince who used agony as a symbol. A ruler who invited the world to supper, only to feed them fear with their lamb and wine. Later, foreign courts would debate whether the event had been staged, if the man impaled was a criminal at all. Some claimed it was a peasant, some said a prisoner of war. It didn't matter. The message had been sent, etched into every memory of those present. Ili, polishing the silver platters the next morning, looked at the blood still staining the cobblestones and wondered, not with fear, but with understanding, what lesson Vlad would teach next. Because the impalements were never random. They were chapters in a single book. And supper with Vlad was only the beginning. The merchant's name was Matthias Klein. He was Saxon, from Brasov, a proud trader in silks, spices, and fine embroidery, well known along the Carpathian trade routes. He had visited Wallachia before and survived it, which was more than many could say. That familiarity bred confidence. And confidence, in Vlad's realm, was a dangerous luxury. Matthias arrived with wagons laden with goods and a dozen guards, none of whom knew what lay ahead. He came not as a diplomat, nor a spy, but as a man of profit. His coins spoke louder than titles, and he believed that Vlad, for all his theatrics, was still a man who recognized the value of trade. He was wrong. The mistake was simple. A minor discrepancy in tax declaration, a few coins short, a ledger entry mismatched. In most lands, it would result in a fine, perhaps a seizure of goods. But not in Wallachia. Not under Vlad. Ili was the one who found the discrepancy. He had taken over as chamber scribe by then, trained in arithmetic and foreign dialects. He flagged the irregularity and brought it to the chamberlain's attention. Within an hour, Vlad had been informed. Within 2, the merchant had been summoned. And by sundown, the ritual had begun. Vlad ordered that Matthias not be touched, yet. Instead, he was escorted to a courtyard where a strange arrangement had been prepared. 20 stakes. All empty. All freshly sharpened. And 1 table. Matthias stood in confusion as Vlad arrived, dressed in a fur-lined robe despite the warmth of the evening. He greeted the merchant with the cordial tone of a host welcoming a dinner guest. Sit, Vlad said. Matthias obeyed, too startled to protest. Wine was poured. Bread broken. A lamb roasted beside them, crackling on the spit. Then Vlad gestured to the stakes. You see those? He asked. Matthias nodded slowly. Each one represents a rule. A truth. A consequence. Vlad reached into his robe and produced a scroll, Matthias's ledger. He laid it on the table. You shorted me. Not much. But enough to insult. The merchant opened his mouth to respond, but Vlad silenced him with a look. Not fury, just absolute stillness. Intent does not matter, Vlad continued. Not here. Only example. And then, in front of Matthias, the soldiers began dragging out the merchant's guards, one by one. They had done nothing wrong. But they were his men. His responsibility. And Vlad did not believe in private penalties. The impalements began at dusk. Matthias watched as his guards screamed, twisted, begged. He shouted, pleaded, even offered triple restitution. Vlad listened, drank, and then ordered more wine. By the sixth stake, Matthias collapsed. But Vlad would not let him faint. He had him roused with icy water and forced to sit upright. This is not punishment, he said. This is purification. Eli, standing silently behind, could feel the tension radiating from every guest, every servant. No one breathed too loudly. No one moved unless ordered. And then Vlad gave the final command. Impale him. Not through the heart. Through the gut. Slow. Matthias didn't scream at first. He made a sound, half moan, half prayer, as the stake pierced his abdomen and began its cruel journey. He looked at Vlad with disbelief, as if even in that moment he hoped for mercy. But Vlad was already walking away. Eli remained behind, ordered to record the event. When he returned to the chamber that evening, he found a note written in Vlad's hand, left on his desk. A merchant without honesty is a soldier with no sword. Both must be made example. It was signed not with a name, but a symbol, the dragon and cross, bleeding into one another. Over the following weeks, the story spread. Traders began doubling their tax offerings. Some refused to cross into Wallachia altogether. Others sent goods through intermediaries, too frightened to enter Vlad's gaze. And Vlad smiled. To him, the merchant's death was a transaction. A message purchased in blood, paid forward in silence. But Eli began to notice something else. The impalements were increasing. Not only enemies now, but dissenters. Minor infractions. Whispers. A baker who sold short loaves. A priest who misquoted a passage of scripture. The stakes filled faster than before. The rituals more elaborate. Sometimes, Vlad would stand for hours before the dying, watching their slow fade like a painter studying a drying canvas. And yet, there was method. Always method. No killing ever felt random. One day, Eli entered the tower library to deliver parchments, and found Vlad alone, staring at a large map of his realm. Pins marked cities. Strings connected castles. But the borders were drawn not in ink, but in small red slashes. You see this land? Vlad said without turning. Eli nodded. It does not breathe unless I make it bleed. Eli didn't speak. He didn't need to. He had seen enough to know, Vlad ruled not with armies, but with memories, memories forged in terror, etched into the spines of the dead. And yet, something darker was beginning to take shape. The stakes were no longer just punishment. They were becoming prophecy. A forest of them would soon rise around Vlad's own castle, not for defense, but declaration. That even in his final stand, he would not retreat quietly. He would build a kingdom of bones. The night was colder than it should have been. Winds swept down from the mountains, whispering through the stone corridors of the castle like breath through a crypt. Targovus stood still, its torches flickering uncertainly, the silence broken only by the clatter of distant hammering, wood upon wood, flesh upon fear. Eli no longer flinched at the sound. He had seen too much, recorded too much, become too much a part of the spectacle to feel surprise. But even he knew that something had shifted. This was no longer a performance for the sake of deterrence. Vlad was preparing for something final. Something absolute. The rumors had already begun to swirl. That the Ottomans were preparing an invasion. That traitors within the boyars were aligning with Hungary. That the Pope himself was considering condemnation. But Vlad didn't seem to care. He was building a new garden. This one did not sit at the borders or near the city gates. It lay within the very courtyard of his own keep, where the soil had been torn and churned, and over 300 stakes were being erected, each carefully positioned, spaced, and measured. They pointed skyward like a thicket of death, waiting for bodies to give them voice. Ili stood by as the first prisoners were brought forward, Hungarian spies, Ottoman deserters, and even 2 local nobles whose loyalty had grown too quiet, as Vlad phrased it. One by one they were raised. One by one the forest grew. It was not the executions that disturbed Ili anymore, it was the quiet of them. Vlad no longer spoke as he once did. No long speeches, no justifications. He simply watched. Sometimes he whispered to himself. Other times he closed his eyes as the victims began their slow ascents up the greased wood. He was dreaming with his eyes open. One evening, just after twilight, Vlad summoned Ili to his chambers, not the grand hall, not the war room, but the high tower where he rarely slept. There, by a single candle and a window that looked down upon the rising field of death, Vlad sat cross-legged, reading from a weathered book of prayers. Ili waited in silence. Without looking up, Vlad said, "They will come for me soon." Ili said nothing. "I've made this land a mirror," he continued. "Every man who gazes into it sees his fear staring back. That is why they want to break it." He finally turned to Ili. "Do you think I am mad?" Ili met his gaze. For the first time in years, he allowed his voice to rise. "I think you believe pain is the only truth men respect." Vlad smiled faintly. "And am I wrong?" Ili looked away. Below, the Impaled twitched in the night wind. Some were still alive. Others had long gone still, their silhouettes turning into a forest of human shadows. The next morning, word arrived: a Hungarian battalion had crossed the border. Reinforced by defected Wallachians, they were pushing toward the capital with intent. Panic rippled through the outer villages, but Vlad gave no orders to flee. Instead, he gave invitations. He opened the gates. He lit the fires. And as the first ranks of the enemy approached, they saw it, stretching from the outer moat to the walls of the inner keep, the new forest. Thousands of impaled bodies, arranged like soldiers on parade. Some faced inward. Some outward. Some wore armor. Some wore nothing at all. And at the very center, on the highest stake of all, was a boyar lord whose betrayal had triggered the invasion. His face had been preserved with wax and oils, his eyes left open, mouth stitched into a frozen scream. It was grotesque. And it worked. The Hungarian forces halted, stunned. Some soldiers refused to march past. Others turned back entirely. Officers shouted, priests crossed themselves, horses bucked. The line broke, not in battle, but in horror. And Vlad watched. From his tower, he stood beside Ili and looked down not just at the death he had arranged, but at the living who now hesitated to face him. "This," Vlad whispered, "is the last lesson." But Ili no longer felt all. Only weariness. There was no joy in this victory. No peace in this power. Just rot and ritual. Within a week, the Hungarians regrouped with greater force. They encircled Targovist. Vlad's own men, worn thin and terrified, began to desert. The stakes could not hold the walls. The prince who ruled with fear was about to meet a world that no longer trembled. In the final night, as the fires of the enemy danced on the horizon, Vlad walked the forest of his own making. Alone. No armor. No crown. He moved among the dead like a ghost among memories, touching each stake as if in farewell. He whispered names. He knelt beside one body and kissed its hand. Ili followed at a distance. When dawn came, the Ottomans breached the city. But they did not find Vlad. Only the stakes. Some claimed he died in battle that morning, charging like a madman. Others said he escaped into the mountains, to return someday when Wallachia needed him again. A few whispered he had impaled himself, choosing to vanish into the very symbol he had made immortal. Ili never said. He simply returned to the keep, gathered the remaining scrolls, and sealed them in a stone chamber beneath the chapel. He left Wallachia that winter, walking away from a land of echoes and ghosts. But sometimes, at night, in other courts and cities, he would wake to the creak of wood, the sigh of wind through dead mouths, and remember. The prince who turned pain into power. The man who planted a kingdom of spikes. The forest that never forgot.